The 2026 Georgia governor's race is underway. Today is the last day for early voting in all of Metro Atlanta's runoff elections, and we are also previewing the 2025-2026 Georgia legislative session. Today is Wednesday, November 27th. Thanks for joining us for this edition of Political Update. From the Atlanta News First breaking news desk here in our studios in Midtown Atlanta. I'm Tim Darnell, joined by our political reporter, Doug Reardon. Doug, we just got through one presidential election cycle. Now we're moving into another election cycle as very recently, Attorney General Chris Carr announced he is the first contender for what will be a highly entertaining and wide-open Georgia governor's race in 2026. We all know that Georgia Governor Brian Kemp is constitutionally prohibited from seeking a third term, and Chris Carr has been widely rumored to be a gubernatorial contender. Those are no longer rumors. He has officially announced his candidacy to become the next Georgia governor, and really he's going to be the first of what we anticipate to be a very crowded Georgia governor's race in less than 2 years.
Yeah, it's always an election year in Georgia, right?
Right.
And so some of the other names that we expect to be on that list, perhaps Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, he hasn't been shy about saying that he wants to run for the next step above his own office now. Also, potentially former Georgia Senator Kelly Loeffler has also shown some interest in running for that seat. But Carr is so far the only one who has actually announced officially that he will be running. And there was a reason that he did that as early as he did. It's because he wants to start fundraising right now. He's actually been exploring donors for a number of years, knowing that Kemp was going to be out of office regardless in 2026. And so whereas some of those names I just mentioned have the means to self-fund their campaigns, Carr said he does not, so he needs to start fundraising before everybody else if he wants to keep up. The problem for him is going to be that Donald Trump, who will be in office when he runs, not really a fan of Chris Carr. After 2020, when Trump was claiming that there were some irregularities and even fraud or meddling in the 2020 election, which he lost here in Georgia, Carr refused to go along with calls for a special session. He also refused to sign on to a lawsuit that was based out of Texas that had to do with overturning some of the results in states where Donald Trump did not win. And so he still is very angry at some Georgia officials over that. We saw as recently as about 6 months ago, he was calling out Governor Brian Kemp on the fallout from the 2020 election. Carr's going to get lumped into that, and that could hurt him when you need a lot of support from that MAGA base here in Georgia to win.
And you mentioned Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones. He is obviously a very strong supporter of now President-elect Trump. Kelly Loeffler, who was rumored at one point to be under consideration for the U.S. Department of, or Secretary of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. That has gone to another nominee, but also some of the other names we've been hearing, perhaps Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. On the Democratic side, perhaps Stacey Abrams, perhaps U.S. Congresswoman Lucy McBath. What are you hearing as far as some of the candidates on the Democratic side?
Both those names. Stacey Abrams actually has already started hiring for a campaign in 2026. Some video and content creators, some spokespeople, those are already up online, so it's a pretty safe bet that she'll be trying it for a third time to claim the governorship of Georgia. Lucy McBath has already indicated her interest in running for the seat. Also, outgoing DeKalb CEO Michael Thurmond, who was also the labor commissioner for Georgia a number of years ago, also has been asked the question directly and has not said no, that he would consider running for governor on the Democratic side. So you have a lot of big names, a lot of people who have been around Georgia politics for a long time vying for this governorship.
I want to circle back to Brad Raffensperger here in a moment, but before we do, today is the last day of early voting in all of Metro Atlanta's runoff elections. That election will be held on Tuesday, December 3rd, the actual runoff election itself. But some of the races that we're looking at in the city of Atlanta City Council post number 3 in DeKalb County. Two very important DeKalb County Commission races in District 3 and District 7. another DeKalb County city, the city of Doraville, District 1, Post 2. Outside or also in Metro Atlanta and some of the outlying counties in Henry County Commission, District 4, and Gwinnett County City Council, District 5. Those elections are all headed for runoffs. Today, Wednesday, November 27th, is the last day of early voting, and those runoff elections will be held on Tuesday, December 3rd. We'll have all of those runoff election results for you here on Atlanta News First and AtlantaNewsFirst.com. Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger really kind of doing a victory lap. He certified the election results of the most recent presidential election here in Georgia very recently. He came under the wrath of former or now President-elect Donald Trump for his role in refusing to certify the 2020 presidential election for Donald Trump. That election really led Joe Biden to winning Georgia and arguably the White House. Talk to us a little bit about the success of the most recent Georgia presidential election. That election was called on the early morning hours after the most recent presidential election. Really, it was a very flawless election, and really, Brad Raffensperger is taking a lot of credit for how smoothly Georgia's presidential election went. You know, with only a couple of weeks ago. Circle back and talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, he had promised a smooth and safe and fair and transparent election, and by all accounts, that's what we got in Georgia. All 159 counties have now been individually certified. They use some combination of their own methods for doing that, whether they be sample audits. There's also a statewide sample audit that is done by rolling the dice and picking random lot numbers to be checked on ballots, and so there were a lot of safeguards in place in between the actual day of voting and the certification, which came last week. So this whole time they've been working to make sure that there were no irregularities. We certainly didn't hear of any here in Metro Atlanta when it came to early voting, in-person voting, or absentee voting. And so now what happens is, since this has been certified by the state itself, Governor Kemp has to sign off on a slate of electors that is going to be sent to D.C. to cast Georgia's 16 electoral votes for Donald Trump when that takes place, as it always does every 4 years at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. there. So it is still not yet officially official. I think we all know and certainly learned 4 years ago that takes place in January. And so that will be the next steps here. But Georgia is good to go. Raffensperger is out of the woods. I think what's interesting is we saw obviously this year Trump win. That was the difference between this year and 2020. But there were no calls for fraud. There were no calls for interference this year, certainly. And I would suspect that has something to do with some of the folks who were calling for it 4 years ago had their candidate win this time around. And so we did not hear any calls like we did in 2020 over some of the irregularities we heard about then.
What a difference 4 years and two presidential elections make. It's really night and day from what Georgia was encountering 4 years ago to what we're encountering right now. Brad Raffensperger obviously is taking on a national profile, probably much more favorably this year than he was 4 years ago, but he is calling on a number of federal and national election reforms based on Georgia's early voting system and how smoothly our election tabulation process went only a few weeks ago. Here's a report from our CBS national correspondents on how Brad Raffensperger is really taking his message of Georgia's election systems and urging national implementation of that system. Here's that report.
At the American Enterprise Institute in the nation's capital on Monday, Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger said his state should be a model for how elections should be run.
Georgia leads the nation in election management. Our elections are accurate, secure, free, fair, and fast. We think that's all come together, and people just saw that nationwide.
The Republican state official has overseen Georgia elections for over 5 years now and underwent national scrutiny for election security following the 2020 presidential election, when then President Donald Trump made a call to Raffensperger to change the results in Trump's favor. but he refused. Now, after a series of election reforms and record turnout in the Peach State, Raffensperger believes now is the time for congressional lawmakers to implement Georgia's reforms all across the country.
Because you think about it, where we are right now with a new Congress, now is just a great opportunity. Look, how can we improve the election process, not just for 1 or 2 states, but for all 50 states?
His key proposals include expanding tools to verify voters' U.S. citizenship, requiring photo ID, banning ballot harvesting, cleaning voter lists, and quick and accurate reporting of results. And he believes the new Congress should be able to pass these proposals.
It's another cycle, and now the Republicans, do have control. But I just think that common sense election reform makes sense.
Raffensperger would like to see lawmakers here take action quickly and hopefully before the next election cycle so voters can have confidence in the process. In Washington, Stetson Miller, Atlanta News First.
We're going to come out of it, and now circling back to previewing the upcoming legislative session in 3, 2, 1. That was a report from our national correspondents on Brad Raffensperger's election reforms packages. Doug, you're going to be covering the upcoming Georgia legislative session. Lawmakers are set to convene in really less than 2 months now at the state capitol for the 2025-26 legislative session. That will be Brian Kemp's last session as governor, as he is constitutionally prohibited from seeking a third term. We're going to listen to a couple of packages from our own Abby Kasouras on possible election or legislative priorities, one dealing with the safe storage of firearms, another dealing with the protection of women in sports. What are some of the other issues you're going to be following for us moving forward?
Those are two big ones, I think. Those are also not necessarily new issues. Certainly the protection of women's sports, there was a Senate commission that was formed in the off-season for the legislature to study any possible legislation that would, this has been a flashpoint issue, certainly for the GOP. We saw Trump tap into it a lot at his rallies, as did we see that with candidates down ballot. This would be the same as it's been in any other state that has tried to attempt this. It would be keeping women, whether they be transgender or biological, out of men's sports and vice versa. Locker rooms would probably play a part in that as well, and so it'll all be based on what this commission has found over the last few months in the Senate. A couple other big things. You mentioned safe storage of firearms after the Appalachia shooting. I think that's going to be a big focal point for legislators, especially on the Democratic side, now that they have that to point to. And then there's always sports betting kind of lurking in the depths of the legislature. It's been tried many, many times, at least in the past 3 years, and it has not worked. There just hasn't been an appetite for it on the Republican side. But this could be the year that we finally get legal sports betting in Georgia. A lot of people want that, even a lot of lawmakers. There's also the budget. We have to keep that in mind. Georgia has a record $16.5 billion surplus. Billion dollar surplus. I got to get my numbers right. $16.5 million surplus, mostly left over from COVID. And so it'll be interesting to see how the governor kind of maneuvers that to get some initiatives done. He's done property tax rebates in the past. He's given raises to educators and police officers and state employees. And so that really reserve has not shrunk much. And so he'll be doing something with that when it comes time for the budget. And then there's always Medicaid expansion, kind of like sports betting. It's always kind of just lurking under the surface. This would give thousands of people more access to Medicaid, but the governor is very wary of tapping into federal programs as a state officer, and so that has been the hesitation there. Maybe this year we've been hearing that Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, who runs the Senate, could have more of an interest in trying to expand Medicaid here in Georgia, so we'll see if that happens.
And that'll be a campaign issue for certain in 2026. Let's go ahead and listen to our two reports from our own Abby Kasouras.
We've got to protect, women's sports. They fought for generations to be equal. Now, please do not interrupt me, sir.
You're not protecting anyone.
I mean, I'm just asking an obvious question. You're protecting women's sports. We're going to be in recess for 5 minutes.
With a loud bang of a gavel, Senator Greg Dolezal, who leads the Protecting Women in Sports Study Committee, suddenly left the room. before returning with muscle. Right now, more than half of the states have passed laws banning or restricting transgender youth participation in sports. Last year, Senator Clint Dixon sponsored a bill with an all-out ban, and he plans to do so again.
I think it's something that we need to move forward with.
Give these kids a break.
Kim Snyder's biological son started expressing gender dysphoria at 4. He transitioned in 3rd grade. She says her child's mental health suffers at the implication that she is dangerous.
Implies that girls need to be protected from my child, my very unathletic, no hand-eye coordination theater kid, but who does want to join the intramural team because that's where her friends are.
Woodstock mom Lisa Blankenship testified that her daughter Katie's collegiate swim career at Roanoke College was tainted when a biological male joined their team.
This isn't a transgender issue, but purely a fairness in women's sports issue.
Katie and 5 other teammates joined a lawsuit against the NCAA, led by former University of Kentucky swimmer Riley Gaines. The 156-page lawsuit against the NCAA was filed here in Georgia last March. The lawsuit argues that allowing biological men to compete in women's sports is a violation of Title IX. No action was taken here today. This week, we've heard renewed calls for a ban from groups like the NCAA and federal lawmakers. In Atlanta, I'm Abby Casoris. This is a draft of the final report of the Safe Firearms Storage Committee. The report includes recommendations like updating education protocol, incentivizing safe storage, and keeping guns away from kids under the age of 18. In September, a 14-year-old student at Appalachia High School killed 4 people and injured 9 others. According to the Barrow County Sheriff's Office, he hid an AR-15 in his backpack, a firearm purchased by his father.
And I will forever remember September the 4th and the impact that it not just had on me personally, but the impact that it had on the work that I think is required of this study committee.
State Senator Emmanuel Jones says meeting after meeting, preventing more deaths has become a driving purpose. His committee report includes testimony from parents who have lost children to gun violence, intentional and unintentional shootings that could have been prevented by safe storage.
I have lived through what could happen when guns aren't properly stored.
He is recommending child access prevention laws, adding penalties, as well as incentives for safe storage devices. Heather Hallett has been advocating for change for over a decade.
I have 3 children myself. We've endured numerous scares and lockdowns and shootings at school and at parties, at gatherings. The idea of losing a child to something that's preventable, that's the why. That's why I'm out here.
Republican leadership, including the Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor, have both said they'll support incentives for gun storage. She's hopeful the full list of recommendations could make it to the governor's desk for his signature.
Really, honestly, have some hope and a little bit of faith that there's going to be something in the middle that we can do in Georgia.
The recommendations include the creation of a statewide office to research the root cause of gun violence and a statewide alert system for students flagged for dangerous behavior. In Atlanta, I'm Abby Casoris.
Thanks to all of you for watching and listening to this edition of Political Update here on Atlanta News First. We broadcast Political Update on all of our streaming platforms every Wednesday at 1 and 1:30 p.m., both on our YouTube channel and wherever you get your podcasts in this holiday Thanksgiving season. We're always thankful for all of our viewers and our loyal listeners. Wishing all of you a very safe and happy Thanksgiving and upcoming holiday season. Thanks again.